Hello, everyone. It is still Christmas, believe it or not. And I think we're all semi-weary, but nevertheless, the feast of the Epiphany, the term means manifestation, how God reveals God's self. And in this instance, open to the world of Gentiles, technically our forebearers in the faith. We are Gentile, we're not Jewish. The passage from Isaiah is at the end of the scroll, and it takes into account that there are many peoples shrouded in darkness, but that God comes as a light in the dark to scatter it, and that the glory of God, the presence of God, will shine upon, in this instance, Jerusalem. All the nations, the coastal lands and those from the east across the Arabian desert will flow to Jerusalem to be led by the light of the example of a people who have encountered God and live accordingly. So it is a vision of those who have encountered God, offering hope and a way out of darkness. It is a universal quest. Ephesians, the writer states that what was unrevealed or unheard of has now been revealed in the person of Christ. And that is that God is not just the God of the Jewish people of Israel, the Israelites, the Hebrews, but that God renews God's covenant with all of humanity in and through the person of Christ. The Magi story, you'll note that the translation now calls them Magi because they are not kings. It does not refer to them as kings. Take note, it does not give a number. The 3 is just conjured up because of 3 gifts. We're not given gender. So it could have been, well, probably was, a large entourage of people. It symbolizes the coming of the nations to encounter God, now that a way has been opened up to the promises that God made first and foremost to Abraham, that God now is renewing that covenant with all of humanity. Let's have a look at the scriptures, and I'll be back to you in a second. Get some coffee. I even feel like having it myself at the minute, and we will look at all these bits and pieces. See you shortly. Welcome back. Part of the background to Matthew's Gospel, in fact, prior to this passage, Matthew gave us the genealogy of Christ, tracing him back to Abraham. Abraham was a Gentile. God called a Gentile to be an ambassador of God to all Gentiles and humanity. When Matthew was writing this, he sees Jesus fulfilling the promise and the covenant that God made with Abraham and Sarah and their descendants, that all the nations, all the peoples of the earth would be blessed in the descendants of Abraham. Another thing to keep an eye on is that in Matthew's Gospel, you have the flight to Egypt, reminiscent of the flight to Egypt, out of Egypt, in fact, in the Exodus, where God redeems God's people, walks with them, and becomes a light in their darkness. Here, the one who is very similar to Pharaoh, a great monument builder included, and also equally prone to violence and cruelty, is King Herod. So he's cast in many ways in the same mold as Pharaoh of old. And Jesus will be a new Moses, leading all humanity, those who wish to participate in the call to be led by the light of God now shining in Christ. The story begins then with this background, and the rising star probably comes from the book of Numbers, chapter 24, where Balaam was called by the king of Moab to curse Israel. And instead, when it comes to cursing him, back then curses had major meaning, today less so. But when it comes to cursing him, in fact, he blesses Israel. He is described as a magos. We have magi, the plural. It just means a seer, a person who was an expert in his own field. In fact, in the Persian court, the magi were the advisors to the king, to the royal household. You have these people who come with their own understanding of the world, astrology, astronomy, and they are searching for God. It leads them to Jerusalem, fulfilling what Isaiah said, the nations shall come to Jerusalem. And Herod, of course, is deceitful, he is treacherous, and he is only thinking of himself, nobody else. But when Herod seeks information from the scribes and elders, who later in the gospel will become arch enemies of Jesus, he is particularly disturbed, as is Jerusalem, that there may be a new king. And of course, Herod historically was only half Jewish. He was Idumean, and he usurped the throne. So he was always looking over his shoulder. So historically, this is in the background as well. But authority that's used and abused, that's deceitful, that is destructive, the whole message of Jesus is going to confront and challenge that, which leads to his death. Here, in a few short scenes, Matthew gives us a heads up as to what's going to be in the gospel and what will follow as soon as Jesus becomes an adult and begins his public ministry. So we get an insight into it here. The Magi, as I said earlier, represent we who are not Jewish, participating in the promises given to the Jewish people through Abraham, the Torah, with and through Moses. And that is now, we have access to this God who promises to be a light in our darkness. And the light, of course, is a way of traveling and navigating this world, often enveloped in darkness, violence, racism, greed, lack of care, everything that could be described as inhuman and subhuman. Those who search for God will find God in the quest to be like the Magi, who are willing to travel, leave what they know out into the unknown, with God as their guide, here represented by a star. And in fact, it is John's Gospel who describes Jesus as the light of the world. He is the one who scatters the darkness, and the darkness is not able to overpower the light. And that's a message we need today, no matter who we are or where we find ourselves. And that is that the Magi, the story thereof, offers hope and possibility to the world. But take note, in the passage from Isaiah, the end of the scroll, chapter 60 here, darkness still envelops people. It can describe, well, our lack of humanity, our sinfulness, another way of putting it. But into that darkness, God became a light to offer us a way out. When the Magi discover Jesus after their long journey, they do not stay there. They don't pitch camp and decide to set up shop in Bethlehem. They leave and go home, but they go home a different way. So an encounter with the light of God, the gospel, with this new message, those of us who are willing to receive it and be open to it, the all-inclusive embrace by God of our fellow human being, no matter what religion, tradition, or none. We're meant to be the light that reflects this goodness we believe in, that is extended to everybody. From a Christian perspective, nobody is not a son or a daughter of God. That does not change. God created us. It is up to us to live the challenge of being human, decent, Christian, caring, to one another. The Magi go home by a different road. Those of us who encounter the gospel, who discover the light of God, are constantly being changed. There's no going back to an old comfortable piety, to an old way of thinking. We build on it. We have been there. It was part of the journey. But now the journey goes forward in a different direction. Let God do the leading, and let the gospel and the message that Jesus is the incarnation of now become incarnate in the community of the faithful, to be a light in the world, to be a light of encouragement and hope. It is the call of the church community. It's our call in a world that is dark, but a darkness that has not overcome it, and a darkness that does not have to overcome us either. Let us remain faithful to this call and continue to be open to discovering Christ anew in the situations and places we find ourselves. God walks with us on the journey of life. In fact, that's the name that Jesus is given by Gabriel when he announces to Joseph, Matthew's Gospel, that his wife is about to bear a child. He shall be called Emmanuel. God is with us. The Gospel of Matthew ends with the same note. I will be with you till the end of time. God does not abandon. We're called to participate in that walking together, accompanying and being the best we can be, and when we fail, to always continue back again. A very happy new year to one and all, and I will see you next week. Take care.